I'll see you soon.
Final Destination 3, the novelization by Christa Faust. Chapter 4. Wendy's head snapped up. She was sitting in the 12th car, sweating and breathing hard. The train was still at the platform. Kevin was sitting beside her. The attendant was walking toward her, an angry scowl on his face, pointing at her camera. She looked up at him, uncomprehending and disoriented. He pointed at a sign. She turned her head as if in a dream. The sign said, "No loose objects, no cameras." Kevin was reaching for the camera, but as he opened his mouth, she already knew what he was going to say. "I'll put it in my pocket, all right?" "I'll put it in my pocket, all right?" The attendant hesitated and then nodded. "Fine." Kevin stuffed the camera in the pocket of his pants. Wendy's heart thudded in her throat, making it difficult to breathe. She raised her head and looked forward, confused and frightened. Ahead of them, Frank was lowering his DV cam and slipping it stealthily under his shirt. Wendy stared at him in horror as the attendant, satisfied that all was ship-shape, started back toward his control panel. Kevin grinned eagerly and started to lean forward. Wendy gasped and grabbed his hand, stopping him from squishing it into the gum that was stuck on the lap bar. Wendy gaped at the gum blankly as Kevin grinned at her. "Hey, thanks," he said. "Good eye." Wendy whimpered under her breath. This was more than deja vu. She knew everything that was going to happen. They were going to crash. Frank Cheek was going to drop his camera and... Wendy turned her head from the gum to the attendant, who had returned to his console. He was flipping up the clear plastic safety casing that covered the launch button, and raising his hand over his head. "And away we go!" he cried, then stabbed a single finger down toward the button. Wendy panicked, pushing desperately at her shoulder restraints. "We need to get out of here!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. "We need to get out of here!" The attendant's finger continued to move down toward the button, syrupy, slow, and inevitable as a nightmare. "No! No! Don't push that button!" Wendy cried. "Don't push that button!" The attendant's finger stopped an inch from the button. He looked up, making a scowling face. "What the hell is this crap?" he asked in a gruff, sour voice. His assistant looked over and saw Wendy struggling against her restraints. He sighed. "Looks like we got a screamer," he said out of the corner of his mouth. They started toward the 12th car, the other passengers looking around to see what all the fuss was about. Kevin stared at Wendy, pulling away from her like she was infectious or insane. "Let me off!" she was shouting. "Everybody needs to get off!" "Wendy! Hey, come on, Wendy! It's all right!" Kevin said, trying to calm her down. He cringed, embarrassed, as everybody was looking their way. "Take it easy. It'll all be over before you know it." Wendy shook her head, wild-eyed. "No! No!" she cried. "It's gonna crash! It's gonna crash!" She knew how crazy she sounded, but she knew what was going to happen. She knew she had to stop it. "Okay, this is beyond a joke now," the attendant growled. "We can't have this kind of shit. Call security." His assistant nodded and turned back toward the console, as the attendant continued towards Wendy's car. In the front car, Jason struggled to turn around, but the restraints held him. "Is that Wendy?" Wendy heard him ask. "What's the matter?" "I don't know," Carrie replied. "Sounds like her." The other passengers in the train squirmed impatiently and shouted insults. The kids waiting in line to go on the next one mocked Wendy and shouted at the attendants to get a move on. The attendant stopped beside Wendy, holding his hands out, placating. "Listen," he said, "you're scaring the other passengers. If you don't stop screwing around, I'm going to have to take you off the ride, okay?" "Not just me. Everybody needs to get off," Wendy said, fending off Kevin's attempts to hold her back and shut her up. "The hydraulics are going to rupture. The tracks will collapse." The attendant paused, shocked by the preciseness of the warning. He grimaced and looked back at his assistant, who nodded as he hung up the phone. He turned back to Wendy. That's pretty much out of nowhere," he said. "You know something we don't? Somebody calling a threat or something?" "I just know. Wendy's face fell. She knew what the attendant was going to say if she told him. But how else could she explain it? I saw it. I saw it happen. It's okay, sir, said Kevin, trying to be the peacemaker. She was just a little upset before. We're okay now. Two heavy-set nylon-jacketed security guards, a big white guy whose embroidered name on the breast of his jacket read "Call Quits," and an even bigger black guy with the unlikely name of Bloodworth, hurried onto the platform from an emergency exit. The attendant whistled them over to Wendy's car, and they crossed quickly, hands on their flashlights. The attendant turned away from Wendy to meet them. "What's going on?" asked Colquitt. The attendant jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "That chick is on dope or something," he muttered. "She's saying a bunch of weird shit about the coaster crashing. She's nuts." Colquitt looked past the attendant to Wendy, who was clinging to Kevin's arm and shivering. The other passengers were shouting and whistling now. A chant started up toward the front and spread down the length of the car. "Let's go! Let's go! Let's go! Let's go! Let's go!" Colquitt bit his lip. "All right," he said. "Let her out." The attendant turned back to his assistant. "Open up 7 through 12, he called. The assistant looked down at the console. There were two buttons, one labeled 1 through 6 and another labeled 7 through 12. He pressed 7 through 12, and all the restraints on cars 7 through 12 released at once, with the hiss of hydraulics. Lewis groaned with relief, along with the rest of the freed passengers. Ashley and Ashlyn turned to look back at the commotion. Frank Cheek grinned at the two girls and stuck his camera in their faces. "So, want to do a little interview while we wait?" he asked. "What's your favorite sexual position?" "Forget it, pervert," Ashley said. Wendy leapt out of the car like it was on fire. Kevin followed reluctantly. Colquitt and Bloodworth took Wendy's arm and led her off to the side. Kevin made to follow, but they waved him back. He crossed his arms and leaned on the car, watching anxiously. Colquitt looked Wendy in the eye. "All right, miss," he said, face grim. "You want to tell me what's the matter?" "She was just a little upset before," Kevin began. He ignored Kevin completely. "Miss?" Wendy hung her head. I don't know," she said in a small, defeated voice. "I saw it in my head. The track broke. The roller coaster crashed." Colquitt and Bloodworth exchanged a blank glance, and Colquitt sighed. You saw it," he frowned. "You mean like a psychic vision or something?" "I know it sounds crazy," she said, "but I know it's gonna crash. It's gonna happen. You have to take everybody off." "I'm sorry, miss," Bloodworth said, shaking his big bulldog head. "We don't shut down the rides without reasonable cause." In the train, Frank Cheek focused in on Ashlyn. "So," he asked, "you girls ever thought about, fooling around together? I mean, you're both so hot. How could you resist?" Ashley and Ashlyn exchanged disgusted looks. "Let's ditch this loser," said Ashley. "Hell yeah," said Ashlyn. They hopped out of the car and started for the exit. Frank stood up. "Hey," he called. "Where you babes going? Wait a minute." He scrambled after them, keeping them framed in the view screen of his DV cam as he ran out the exit. Lewis looked over Ian and Aaron's heads at Kevin, sneering. "Dude, what the hell's the matter with you?" Lewis said. "You need to control that bitch." "Fuck off, Lewis," said Kevin. "Even if she was my girlfriend, which by the way she isn't, I'm not some fucking caveman like you." Lewis failed to fuck off. He raised his voice to a girly squeak mimicking Wendy. "We're gonna crash! We're gonna crash!" He grunted and returned to his normal voice. "She's probably trying to get some attention, just like a bitch." The two hooded girls slipped out of their car and away without a word, heads close together and exchanging whispers. Wendy looked down embarrassed, but Kevin turned and started toward Lewis. "Hey, enough already," Kevin said, face flushed and angry. "Leave her alone." "Why do you care?" Lewis asked. "I thought you said she wasn't your bitch." "She isn't anybody's bitch," Kevin said, "and I said leave her alone." Lewis's voice rose up into high-pitched baby talk again. "Leave her alone! Leave her alone!" Lewis smirked. You're starting to sound just like a bitch yourself, man. Hey, fuck you, shouted Kevin. Louis stood up in the car. Fuck me? Fuck you! He pushed Kevin. Kevin grabbed for him, and Louis blocked the grab with the sweeping left, accidentally backhanding Aaron, who was cowering in the car behind him. Ow, you dick! She cried, hand up to a bright red mark on her paper-white cheek. Fucker! Ian stood up and threw a weak punch at Louis, who returned it with the wide haymaker. Ian ducked and grabbed Louis's arm. Kevin took advantage and leapt on Louis, throwing punches. Bloodworth and Colquitt turned at the noise of the fight. What the hell? Said Bloodworth. Colquitt advanced, hefting his flashlight. Hey! He called. Break it up! Break it up! The two security guards waded into the fight, trying to push the combatants out of the car. One of the passengers in the front half of the car started chanting a line from an old Ramones song. Hey-oh, let's go, they cried. Hey-oh, let's go. The rest of the riders picked it up. In car number 1, Jason was turning and craning his neck, trying to see what was happening. All he could see were the tops of Kevin and Louis's heads, and fists flying. Let me out, he cried. Louis, you asshole, get off him, I'll fuck you up! Colquitt and Bloodworth dragged and pushed Kevin, Ian, and Louis out of the cars, and shoved them to the ground. Kevin and Louis kept slugging each other. Aaron followed Ian, weeping. Wendy looked on with her hands over her mouth. Everybody who could was turning around and watching. Let me off! Jason was shouting. Wendy! Kevin! Hang on, I'm coming! Colquitt looked up from trying to hold Kevin and Louis apart. He shook his head at the attendant. No way, he said. Don't let anybody else out. We don't need any more trouble. He scanned the cars and waved at the attendant. Get the rest of them out of here. Start the ride. All right. The attendant nodded and then returned to the console. Hey-oh, let's go, chanted the remaining riders. No! No, you can't! Screamed Wendy. She started toward the attendant. Colquitt broke away from the scuffle and bustled after her. The attendant pushed the 712 button, and all the restraints on the empty seats closed at once. Let me off! Bellowed Jason. Stop! Stop! Screamed Wendy. The tracks are broken. The cars are going to crash. She grabbed the attendant's arm. He shoved her back, and Colquitt caught her and pulled her away. Wendy fought and squirmed fiercely against him. Don't! Don't! She begged. Don't! Please! Please! The attendant ignored her and pushed the button. Wendy looked toward the front of the train as it jolted into motion. Jason! She shrieked, but she couldn't find his face. The train disappeared into the tunnel. She sagged in Colquitt's arms. Colquitt shook her angry. What the hell do you think you're doing? He asked. You don't touch the equipment. You don't assault the staff. We could have you arrested. Kevin stood up as Bloodworth muscled Louis up and pushed him, Aaron, and Ian toward the door. Kevin started toward Colquitt. Hey, ease up, he said. Give her a break. She freaked out. Let her settle down. She'll be all right. Yeah, said Colquitt. She'll settle down at home, and so will you. Colquitt grabbed Kevin's arm and turned him toward the exit. You guys are 86th with all the rest. He kicked open the emergency exit and pushed them through. They went down a short flight of steps to another door and went through that. They came out outside right next to the superstructure of the roller coaster. One of the loops was right overhead. The half-full train rocketed above them. Squeals of joy and excitement reached their ears. See? Said Colquitt, sneering. Everything's fine. It was just your imagination. Yeah, Wendy, said Kevin. It's all right, see? Colquitt started to lead Wendy and Kevin away from the coaster. Suddenly, the metal pillars of the superstructure groaned and shuddered, as if subject to unusual stress. The three of them turned simultaneously and looked up, trying to find the train in the clutter of beams, posts, and track. As they watched, it rose up over a hill. The front car was shooting up a huge plume of sparks. Wendy's mouth dropped open in horror as she realized that her vision was really coming true. What the hell? Colquitt said. Kevin gaped with stunned disbelief. No way, he whispered. Colquitt's hands fell away from Wendy and Kevin's arms. Through the pipes, the three of them watched as the damaged car raced for the second loop. There was a scream of rending metal and the crunch of horrifying mechanical impacts. Red and orange lights flickered. They flared off the slack contours of their stunned faces. Wendy shrieked, "Jason!" Chapter 5. Wendy sat sleepless and numb on the foot of her bed. It was 5:15 a.m. She had not slept. In fact, she'd barely slept more than an hour at a stretch since the accident. The accident, that word accident, uttered so many times by officials, her parents, and the media that it no longer seemed to have any real meaning for Wendy. The details of that horrible night were alternately painfully vivid, then dull and distant, like something viewed underwater. Certain images stuck like shrapnel in her mind. One of Carrie's slutty shoes, wet with blood, lay on the ground next to an empty paper cup. The look of raw, superstitious fear on Colquitt's face as he backed away from Wendy, wiping the hand that had touched her on his pant leg as if she were contagious. On the other hand, things that seemed important, like what happened to Kevin or how she got home from the park, were all a jittery blur of overlapping confusion. That was 14 days ago. 324 endless hours that felt like centuries, during which Wendy moved like a silent sleepwalker through her house, while her mom and sister tiptoed around her and treated her like she was made of glass. Her sister cried constantly, flinging herself into a sobbing heap on the nearest piece of furniture at the least provocation, and acting almost as if she were more affected than Wendy by what had happened that night. Her mother, Sophie, was well-meaning but mostly ineffectual, prone to hysteria, and fearful of everything she didn't understand. Unable, as always, to find a way to communicate with her distant and shell-shocked daughter, she had seized on food as her solution and went on a mad cooking spree. She followed Wendy around with carob brownies, whole wheat cheese sticks, fresh mango, and a million other healthy treats, begging her to just have a little something to eat, something to keep her strength up. The thoughts of eating anything repulsed Wendy, but she forced herself, if only to make her mother feel better. Her father, on the other hand, was far more understanding. He and Wendy had always been close, often sneaking off together to dodge her mother's endless restrictions and swearing each other to secrecy after watching a forbidden movie or eating unacceptable junk food. He was a quiet, thoughtful man who liked fixing things and taught Wendy how to play cribbage. Julie was their mother's baby, but Wendy had always been her daddy's girl. There was more to the father-daughter relationship than that, because Grant Christensen was also a Marine. He had been shipped off to the Gulf War when Wendy was a toddler, and baby Julie was still in the hospital from the first of her complex open-heart surgeries. He'd taken a bullet in the right knee and received a medical discharge from the service less than 6 months later. But several of his closest friends had never made it home from Desert Storm. When Wendy got back to the house that awful night, her mother had assaulted her with sobbing hysterics and hot, smothering embraces, clutching at Wendy and wailing. Her father had simply looked into her eyes and let her know without words that he understood. Several days later, when Wendy was standing in the living room and staring unseeing at some flashy car commercial on the television, her father came in and sat down on the couch. He just sat there for a long, silent minute, watching the screen as the car commercial changed to a cereal commercial and then spoke. "It gets easier," he said. "I know it's hard to believe that now when you're all locked down and frozen, but eventually time passes and it will be safe to feel again. For now all you can do is live through each minute." Wendy really hoped that he was right, but living through each minute was like living through an ice age. She couldn't sleep, but she really didn't feel awake either. Nothing seemed real. She felt like a big dead puppet, just going through the motions. Everything she did seemed utterly pointless now that Jason was dead. The funerals were like a dream, distant and half-remembered. Wendy had stood there as they lowered Jason to the ground, watching them shovel dirt over the coffin and remembering the strong, beautiful body that she would never have a chance to know. She'd felt like some kind of imposter, like an automaton that moved only in simple, programmed, repetitive ways, nodding her head, accepting condolences from members of Jason's family that she had never met. "Yes, I'm his girlfriend," she said over and over, until she wanted to scream. Jason's mother had collapsed into howling tears and had to be supported by Kevin. But Wendy felt nothing. All of her emotions were frozen under 6 feet of ice. As the days dragged on, she lived in constant fear of that ice melting. Her vast, monstrous anguish and loss, once it was unleashed, she knew it would eat her alive. So she stayed frozen. She took care of things, did chores, organized her desk, sought comfort in order. Her bedroom, her beloved little sanctuary where everything was exactly the way she liked it, now seemed like a meaningless prison full of things that no longer mattered. She found herself remembering how hard she had fought for the spare, modern white-on-white look she'd wanted for her room. Julie had chosen an over-the-top, glittery Middle Eastern brothel style for her room. To Wendy, it always looked like the aftermath of a catfight between drunken belly dancers, and she longed for simplicity and clean, precise lines in her own private space. Her mother had argued that white would be too hard to keep clean, but Wendy had insisted, and every surface of her little sanctuary was as immaculate and pristine as the day she had painted over the happy lions and giraffes of her childhood. Sitting there now in the cool pre-dawn hush, all her efforts seemed so irrelevant. The chaos that she sought to tame within the walls of her orderly white sanctuary had finally won. All the obsessive-compulsive magic in the world had been unable to stop it. She had gone through the room the night before like a sudden hurricane, struggling to eradicate anything that reminded her of Jason, any painful sparks that might melt her protective ice. There were so many things, so many memories. She had packed away the obvious stuff, the photos, a sweatshirt of his that he had let her borrow one night when she was cold, birthday cards, a stuffed bear he gave her when she had the flu, and a postcard of Wednesday Addams from the old television series, cut into the shape of a heart. It seemed like everywhere she turned there was something else waiting to ambush her with hot, painful memories. If only she could eliminate everything that reminded her of Jason, she could keep the tears from coming. She knew that if she started crying, she would never be able to stop. In her desperate and obsessive need to control her feelings by controlling her environment, she packed away every single thing she could find, but it was impossible to eliminate everything. Jason had been so much a part of her life. Everywhere her gaze fell, there was something that led her mind back to him. A light blue dress that he had always teased her about because he said it made her look like someone's mom. A framed photo of her dead grandmother that he always turned to the wall when he came over, because he said he thought the old gal didn't approve of him, and he didn't like her watching them. Wendy kept seeing herself push him away that afternoon on the lunch quad, telling him there would be plenty of time for kisses later. She had been wrong. There was no more later for Jason. For Wendy, on the other hand, later was just an endless dry stretch of empty, frozen nothing. In the chilly pre-dawn darkness, she wished over and over that she had just kept her mouth shut, just stayed on that ride and died with Jason. Then it would all be over. Wishing was useless. All she could do was get up, take a shower, brush her teeth and hair, and pick out clean clothes. Keep moving, keep busy, and never let the ice melt. Today was graduation day. She had not been back to school since the accident, and although Julie had offered to pick Wendy's diploma up for her, Wendy knew there were things she needed to take care of herself. She could not just stay locked in her room forever. Life went on, and she had to face the world eventually. Wendy got up and started getting ready. Chapter 6. Kevin found that he didn't need to be asleep to have nightmares. All he had to do was close his eyes. The flood of horror and carnage came back again and again, as vivid and awful as the night of the accident. When the coaster crashed, Kevin had cast off the clutching arms of the security guards and ran to the scene of the smoking wreck. out of some misguided idea that he could help, could save someone, anyone. That had been the worst mistake of his life. The things he saw had been burned into his mind forever. He saw a girl's long brown hair coiled around a jagged chunk of metal, a wet red flap of scalp on one end, and a cute pink scrunchie on the other. He saw a meaty slab of ribs that looked just like ribs in a butcher shop, only they were all dirty on one side and sitting incongruously beside a giant fiberglass ice cream cone that had split down the middle and fallen over. It had been hard to tell the difference between metal and bone. Everything was slick with blood and hydraulic fluid, and the fragments of broken coaster cars seemed moist, organic, and violated. By comparison, the mechanical structures of the shattered human body seemed artificial and contrived. When he finally found what was left of Carrie, Kevin only recognized her by the glint of crystal that dangled from her navel piercing. When he spotted it, it was half buried in a messy stew of red, purple, and black. There was a long, jagged white bone sticking out that might have been a leg or maybe an arm, but he couldn't see anything that looked even remotely like a head. That's when the ill-advised deep-fried Snickers came back with a vengeance. The horrific stench of hot metal and burned plastic were mixed with the odors of death and blood, and the rich, shitty stink of entrails. The stink wormed its way deep into Kevin's nostrils as he vomited again and again, kneeling in the bloody dust with tears streaming down his cheeks. When he was able to stand, someone tried to lead him away, someone in a uniform, but he would not go. He had to find Jay. He searched through the wreckage in endless, frantic circles, but he never found anything that he could be sure was Jason. Just pieces, grisly, unrecognizable pieces, and ragged scraps of those stupid McKinley t-shirts, jaunty and ironic letters proclaiming, "I survived Devil's Flight." It was all like some awful kind of joke. He kept telling himself that maybe Jay was okay somehow, maybe he was alive and taken away by an ambulance or something. Then the thought of Jay made him think of Wendy. He had promised Jason that he'd take care of Wendy, and then he'd left her alone. He ran back to where they'd been standing, but she was gone. The last thing he remembered was half sitting, half falling down on his ass on the tarmac, with his arms wrapped around his shaking body. He must have been crying because his cheeks felt wet, but he couldn't hear anything. It was as if his head was stuffed with cotton. The next thing he remembered was being home, sitting on the couch with his dad and mom and 3 brothers, all stiff and static, placed like ceramic figures in a drugstore nativity scene. "Buck up, son," his father had said. "Be glad you got off." No one else said anything, and eventually Kevin got up and went into his room. He could tell that his family was more embarrassed by his anguish and grief than anything else. They wanted him to feel better, not so much because they loved him, but because then the whole uncomfortable business of dealing with his untidy emotions would be over with. Kevin's family had always revolved around his father. His father was a stout, blue-collar bull of a man who had brought himself up by his bootstraps and now owned his own custom shelving business. He despised displays of emotion or other signs of weakness, so the entire family habitually avoided that sort of unpleasantness. Living with Kent Fisher was like living under a shaky military truce. So long as no one broke the rules, you could almost pretend everything was okay. Kevin could not let his father see him cry, but tears were never far from the surface. The pain of losing sweet, saucy little Carrie, and his best friend and oldest friend in one freakish accident, was more than Kevin could handle. Everything he saw or did reminded him of one or the other, tearing off the fresh scab over and over so it never had a second to heal. He spent that first weekend locked in his room, beating his fist against his pillow and hating himself for being so weak. He thought of Carrie scolding him about telling her to take the back seat with Wendy. He should have insisted, then she would still be alive. He missed Carrie so badly, her smell and her laugh, the comfort of her warm little body curled against his, and her earthy, voracious carnality. But any thoughts or feelings that were even remotely sexual filled him with tortured confusion and anguish. If he thought of someone else, he was instantly torn by a swift and powerful shame, as if he were cheating on Carrie. If he thought of Carrie, he would be crushed by sadness and depression and the loss of the future they would never have together, or worse, haunted by the horrific memory of finding her ruined, bloody remains. And in the end, the thing that obsessed him night and day, the thing he could not get out of his head, was everything he had done wrong that night. Why hadn't he done something more to save Carrie? Why hadn't he listened to Wendy and lent his voice to hers to get Jay and Carrie off the doomed ride? But deeper and more disturbing than that was the question of how Wendy had known the ride would crash. Time passed, but it never got easier. The hurt just matured, like wine, growing darker and more potent. He went back to school just to have something to do, but he found he could no longer relate to any of his friends. Callow jocks who all just wanted to punch him in the shoulder and laugh it off. They even talked about hooking him up with some slut they knew who had no gag reflex and would make him forget all about the whole thing. In a surprising show of compassion, Kevin's father had agreed to let Kevin keep Jason's dog, a goofy boxer bulldog mix named Betsy. Jason's mom could barely take care of herself in the aftermath of the accident, and her sister wanted to take Betsy to the pound. He couldn't let that happen. Kevin thought his father was going to wig out about it, but instead he just nodded, patted Betsy's head, and said, "I like a bulldog." Dumb, sweet Betsy made things a little easier for Kevin. She seemed to have no idea that anything was amiss. Just when Kevin would think the pain and grief was going to crack his skull wide open and splatter the walls with his tortured brains, Betsy would come over and put some disgusting, slobbery, squeaky toy in his lap. She would look up at him with that smushed face and crooked, goofy underbite, and he would have to laugh. She made the passing days almost bearable. Graduation had snuck up on him. It seemed impossible to Kevin that 2 whole weeks had passed, and yet here it was, the night before graduation. Every day things were continuing to happen all over the world, things that Jason and Carrie would never see. News events were taking place that they would never know about. New songs hit the charts, songs they would never hear. Movies came out that they would never watch. It seemed so horrendously unfair. Sleepless and wired and tormented with unrelenting guilt and sadness, Kevin found himself poking around online, looking up information on precognition, psychic visions, and anything that might give him some kind of insight into what had really taken place that night. What he found chilled him deeply. He knew he had to find Wendy and talk to her about the things he had uncovered. She was the only one who would understand. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Final Destination 3, the novelization of the movie by Christa Faust. Really enjoyed chapter 4, her snapping out of her premonition, the way everything went down, trying to warn everybody off of the roller coaster, the ones that got off, the fights breaking out. I love that little squabble between Kevin and Lewis. I thought it was cool that we had a little Bloodworth cameo there. Makes me wonder if he was supposed to be in the movie as a security guard there, Wondering if his character is going to pop up again in the book. Who knows? But, come on, Bloodworth. That had to be him, right? And, if she got the Frank guy off of there who had the video camera, isn't that what really caused everything whenever his camera, wrapped around, one of the beams and, him getting off? I don't know, it's just weird. I guess it was also the hydraulics on that one restraint thing. So yeah, I guess, I don't know, it's just, I just figured taking some of them off might change some of the things that happened and not make it crash, but this is Final Destination. I'm probably missing something or overlooking a small detail. It has been a few days since I read the last chapter, and I have not seen this movie in forever. But after all that was said and done, it felt good to be reading a Final Destination book where after the premonition happened, it didn't spend 3 chapters of the person who saw the premonition having to explain themselves to police and stuff, Because, I mean, it's a roller coaster. How could she have, done something to it? It's just, I guess, it's just like she's just had last-minute thoughts and got scared, got cold feet, wanted to get off of it. And it just happened to crash, I guess. Either way, I'm glad that we didn't have to spend a lot of time with her having to explain herself before really getting into the minds of the characters that survived the roller coaster crash. With Chapter 5 and 6, we got to really get inside of the heads of Wendy and Kevin. I really enjoyed Wendy's time talking to her dad and everything. That was really sweet. But I understand her pain and what she's got to be feeling, kind of like it said, that she wished she had stayed on there, that survivor's guilt kicking in, which is going to be interesting when it gets to the point of fighting to stay alive later. How much is that going to outweigh the other side? Kevin, on the other hand, man, I understand his character so much more now that we got to deal with his parents and his family and how callous and seemingly uncaring they are. I really don't trust his dad with that bulldog, though. As a dog lover, I was like, no, he might be petting that bulldog and saying he likes a bulldog, but don't leave him alone with that dog. Maybe overreacting there, but yeah, that dad sounds like a son of a bitch. But yeah, I kind of understand Kevin now and his character because of what he has to put up with at home. His dad just seems like a real piece of work, and it sounds like the rest of his family is just scared of the dad, so they just toe the line. I'm curious to see what the other survivors are up to, and I'll be back very soon, and I'm pretty sure this book's going to get right with it. We'll probably get a few more chapters and stuff with the characters dealing with their survivor's guilt or however they're dealing with it. But I have a feeling with the history I've read Christa Faust's work, and when death comes a knockin', I think this book is really going to take off and be a really fun read/listen. So I'll see you very soon with more of Final Destination 3. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 slasher librarian saying thanks for listening. Have a great night, and I'll see you soon.